Do you have investment properties you're considering selling and would like to learn how to defer the tax consequences? Then you need to call Equity Advantage and learn about a 1031 exchange. A 1031 exchange is a powerful investment tool. It enables you to keep a property's equity intact when it's used to acquire like-kind replacement property of equal or greater value and equity, even if you recently acquired the property. For over 30 years, Equity Advantage has been providing investors solutions for deferring taxes and maximizing the value of investments through a 1031 exchange. At Equity Advantage, we don't sell investments, but rather provide the tax deferment tools and expertise to facilitate their sale and transfer. Learn more by going to 1031exchange.com. or Google YouTube Equity Advantage for in-depth videos. Listen, you've worked hard for the money in your investments. Equity Advantage works hard to keep it yours.
Learn more about 1031 exchanges and Equity Advantage at 1031exchange.com. That's 1031exchange.com.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday, and it's honestly provocative talk for America. Try this on for size. Why won't Ukraine's president resign if it means there might be peace? I'll give you the details. It comes from one of the best investigative reporters of the last half century, and that is Seymour Hersh. But I'll give you the details in just a moment. First, welcome to the program. And if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every weekday at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, you call in and you say to the producers, that Lars, he's full of baloney. Let me tell you or tell him why he's wrong. I'd be glad to have you do it. 866-439-5277. More than a quarter century we've been promising that naysayers always go to the head of the line, and we will always hold to that promise as long as I am here. But glad to have you with me. If you want to send an email, talk@larslarson.com. It's spelled O-N the way God intended instead of E-N like my Norwegian Scandinavian brothers. But you can also answer our Twitter poll. And that question is this: should the government notify you if a convicted predatory sexual pedophile moves in next door to you? I would say yes. There are people who are saying no. Democrats like the governor of Washington State, Jay Inslee, who actually line item vetoed that out. A requirement that on tribal nations and in local communities that the bill said you have to let people know when a predator, a sexual predator, a level 3 sex offender is moving in. And he said, no, we can't let that happen. Now, if you can explain that to me as a naysayer, I'd be glad to hear the explanation. And what's coming up this hour? While the FBI falsely investigated Donald Trump for allegedly colluding with Russia, only to find out that it never, ever happened, and we knew that from the beginning, was Hillary Clinton really the one taking bribes from foreign countries, and the FBI knew all about it? If they show up at your door asking anything other than the time of day and what you think about the weather, I wouldn't talk to them. I wouldn't say a word to the FBI, and I haven't committed any crimes. Are term limits the only way to clean up corruption and lobbying in the United States Congress? We'll get into that this hour. What's the latest in Kari Lake's trial contesting the results of the 2022 governor's race in Arizona? We'll get you an update. And take a moment to cast a vote in that Twitter poll. You'll find it two places, at Lars Larson Show on Twitter, larslarson.com, our website that is free from any kind of censorship. And the Twitter poll is always brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined the group. You should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Now, last week on the Twitter poll, we asked you, should parents call the police on teachers who give students inappropriate sexual books about LGBTQ? I said yes to that. So did 88% of you. Only 12% of you said no to it. Now, before I go to your calls, a shout out to our friends in Battle Creek, Michigan. Yes, you can say Kellogg's, who listen to Great Talk Radio on WBCK. That's FM 95.3 in Battle Creek, Michigan. And of course, you can find my show there as well. But I want to tell you about what Seymour Hersh has been reporting. He, of course, broke the big story last year, and that was it was the Biden administration, in concert with others, who actually blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And Joe Biden even admitted on camera. He said he was going to bring the pipeline to an end. And when a reporter asked him, how are you going to do that? He said, we got a way to do it. And it wasn't long after that, the pipeline was blown up. Cy Hersh broke that story. He also got this one. He says something else is cooking in Ukraine. European leaders have made it clear that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, can keep what he's got, the villa in Italy, his interests in offshore bank accounts. Sounds like a totally legitimate president of a country. If he works up a peace deal, even if he got paid off, if it's the only way to get a deal. So far, the officials say Zelensky has rejected that advice, ignored offers of large sums of money to ease his retreat into an estate he owns in Italy. There's no support in the Biden administration for any settlement that involves Zelensky's departure, and leadership in France and England, according to Cy Hirsch, are too beholden to Joe Biden to even contemplate such a scenario. So remember, we're all paying for this war. America is funding the vast majority of it. What Europe throws in is a pittance by comparison. And here's a great quote. And Zelensky wants more, the official says. Zelensky is telling us, if you want to win the war, you've got to give me more money and more stuff. He says, I've got to pay off the generals. He's telling us that if he is forced out of office, he's going to the next highest bidder. He'd rather go to Italy than stay and possibly get killed by his own people. All of that credit to Seymour Hirsch. Now to your calls. Let's start with Don. Hey, Don, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind today?
Oh, I was going to talk about two things. First is the weaker of the two. Teachers get married, have kids, so the kid goes to school, and another teacher determines that that kid should be of a different sexual orientation.
Yep.
What happens?
What happens?
And I'd like to have some teachers call in. I'd like to have some teachers call in and say what they would do.
Well, you're not doing the topics here, Don. What do you think should happen?
Well, I think it should be the same. If they're going to do it to my kids or my grandkids, then they should do it to any grandkids.
I think that's perfectly fair. What was the other thing?
The other thing is Biden. I belong to a coffee group, and we've all agreed pretty much. He's going to give, and he already said this, green cards to all the people coming up through the border illegally.
That takes an act of Congress. Do you think he's going to get the current Congress to sign off?
He'll try. I think he will try. And then
I try how? He'll ask the Congress, because he doesn't ask the Congress for very much.
I know. He don't talk.
And you know why? He doesn't ask them because he knows they're going to tell him no. Even his Democrat buddies in the Senate are going to say, I'm not going to vote for green cards for illegal aliens because that'll get me shut out of the U.S. Senate very fast. And his Democrat friends in the House will say the same. So when you say he's going to try, what in the world is he going to do to try and get green cards that can only come from an act of Congress?
Well, he'll try to cram it through.
Okay, fair enough. Don, thanks very much. I appreciate the call. And by the way, do you remember last year when Joe Biden vowed we would not be sending tanks to Ukraine? And then a few months later, he said, we will be sending tanks to Ukraine. And then about that same time, reporters started asking, well, how about F-16 fighter jets? Are we going to send those to Ukraine? And Joe Biden said, no, we're not going to send F-16s to Ukraine. Well, guess what? Even NBC News, the mainstream corporate media, they say America and their allies plan to provide F-16s to Ukraine, although the fighter jets may not necessarily come directly from the United States. So a fighter jet pioneered by the United States, it'll have to pass through another country, like some knockoff purse on its way to New York City, where they say, well, it's not an American F-16, it's an American F-16 from some other country. Yeah, they know where it's coming from. And they plan to do this as a long-term effort to strengthen the country's security. That from a senior Biden administration official. This is a serious escalation of the war in Ukraine. Great, we're going to escalate the war in Ukraine. And what does National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan say? He says giving jets to the Ukrainians is going to prevent World War III. And if you believe that, well, I got a bridge to sell to you. Back in a moment. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and always glad to get to your calls. I'll do that in a bit, but I want to talk to my friend Tracy Beans. I was just telling my producer, Tracy, I said, Tracy, as the editor of Uncover DC, brings a lot to this show, and I don't say that to you often enough on the air, so thank you for what you do, Tracy. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Lars. It's really a pleasure to be here with you every week and talk to you and your amazing audience. Today's the Carrie Lake trial. We're going to do a little quick dissection of what happened this past week.
Let's do it.
All right, cool. So they were in court on the signature verification portion of things, right? And the
Yep.
judge limited this down to something absolutely impossible and ridiculous. But outside of that, they brought evidence to the table that there were over 297,000 signatures verified in less than 3 seconds per signature. And the majority of those signatures were approved at a rate of 99%, meaning the faster that they approved signatures, the less they looked at them. So you would expect somewhere around an 80 to 82% pass rate with a written signature on a first round of verification.
Right.
This just it befuddles anyone with a brain. They had a signature expert come in to testify on behalf of Carrie Lake's team, and he testified it is absolutely impossible to accurately compare, as the statute requires, two signatures in that short a period of time. Now, Maricopa County could have brought their own expert in to say it is possible and here's how it can be done. They could have also disputed the data, which they actually got from Maricopa County, but they didn't do that either. Instead, they resorted to technicalities about what Carrie Lake was supposed to be proving versus what she presented.
And now, let me ask you this, because I've tried a few years ago when we were coming up on the 2020 election. Adam Laxalt, I've met him a time or two, but he was former attorney general in Nevada. He was complaining months before the election, saying he went down to signature verification, down to the election center and said, "How are you doing signature verification?" They said, "We've got it to almost 100%." And he said they were bragging that instead of rejecting 2 or 3% of the signatures, they were rejecting virtually none of them. And you think, what would the board of directors of a bank say if they said, "Yep, when people sign a check, which is moving large amounts of money around generally, we almost reject no signatures at all." If you were sitting in the board of directors of a bank and you'd say, "Hold on, that doesn't sound very good because we know there's a fair amount of fraud that goes on involving checks," and you say, "Yeah, but at our bank, almost all the signatures get verified," that immediately should evoke a lot of suspicion, shouldn't it?
Absolutely, especially when, a few years ago they said it would take between 20 and 25 seconds at least to do what they're supposed to do. And additionally, what also came out at trial is that they had, 6 or 7 people doing verification for the cameras in the first room that was broadcast online, right?
Right.
And then in the back, unbeknownst to even the first-line signature verification people that were in that room, they had another 100 and something people doing signature verification outside of the view of anybody. Also came out at trial that you could do signature verification virtually, which is against the law. And, several other things happened. Like they got one of the folks from Maricopa County, Ray Valenzuela, changing his answers 3 and 4 and 5 times. They had a video of a gentleman who was sitting there just clicking a button, click, 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 no scrolling on the screen to scroll down to the signature that you need to use to compare. It was just a complete and utter disaster for Maricopa County if we had justice. Now, during trial, the judge is very fair and he's very accommodating and he's very, forthright with everybody. But when he sits down to write his opinion on these things, we've learned he's not so much that way. So there's going to be another appeal on this, and it's going to go up through the ranks no matter what the decision, and it'll ultimately probably end up back at the Arizona Supreme Court again, and we'll maybe be a year into Katie Hobbs' term before we really know who won this election.
Okay, so let me ask you about this. Most of the time, the media loves trials. They love the O.J. trial. They love, young mothers who kill their children. They love these things that are usually pretty tawdry, and really, when it comes to children being the victims, they're pretty ugly. And they love covering those things wall to wall. Is Carrie Lake's trial that involves the validity of actual elections, is that getting much media attention at all?
Oh, it's only getting media attention for people to report about how she's wrong, she read the data wrong, it isn't proper, it isn't correct. Of course, they're not covering the actual trial, Lars. That would be journalism. We don't have journalism anymore in this country.
Well, what's sad about that is, you know what I'd like to know, Tracy? The other day I read that AI has got both good stuff and bad stuff. I mean, I tell people it's like my chainsaw. I can use it to do a lot of productive work. I could also cut off my arm. It's good and bad. And they said, well, if you use AI the right way, you can take a radiograph, an X-ray, and read it and detect breast cancer, years earlier than it actually occurs. Has anybody suggested that maybe they take some of the actual data from the signature verification that apparently in many states is done by human eyeballs and just approve, and run it through and let them take a look at whether or not they can detect a greater level of bad signatures, and do it not just to improve the system, but say when all these human beings are saying, yeah, all these signatures are valid, are they actually valid? Is there any way to test? Because that may be the tough thing, is prove that they weren't valid SIGs. Well, we had human eyeballs look at it, and they passed them right on by. And then you have to take their word for it that the signatures didn't vary enough. I guarantee you that the signature card I signed about 19 years ago does not at all match my signature today. It's somewhat different. And yet my signature seems to fly right through the election process.
That's not necessarily the best solution, in my opinion, because goodness knows who's programming the algorithm that's
running
the AI.
I get that too. But then then where do we get who shall guard the guardians? In other words, when they say we have a system and it works, you go, how do you know it works? Because they approve all the signatures and they reject very few. Okay, well, how do we know that's real?
The whole argument here is they're not following procedure. So what we really need is more of us. The reason why we even got this case in the first place is because so many people stepped up from 2020 to work these positions in Maricopa County. And they said, something's definitely not right here. We have to come forward. It is such a terrible onion to unpeel and wade through and separate, Lars. I don't even know what the best solution for this is at this point. But today, Arizona Senate put out a thing that you're not allowed to use machines anymore unless they meet a certain specification for United States programming and all kinds of other stuff under a law that they passed. And so as of right now, none of the machines in Arizona meet this. So
they don't?
They do not.
Jeez.
They do not. So there will be no machine voting as of today in Arizona.
I mean, isn't ultimately the test of any security system would be to say, okay, let's take a known quantity. We'll take 1,000 ballots that have all been signed, and we know, say you create fairly good, reasonable facsimiles of signatures that we know are wrong. So this, in the same way that I think it was George Gallup developed polling, he said, let's take a known quantity where we know what the result was and then see what kind of sample we can take that'll give us an accurate result from the unknown quantity. So you say, we know how it does with 50,000. Now let's take a sample of the 5,000. If they were to test these machines by saying, okay, here's a bunch of signatures, tell us how many bad ones there are. And you know, because you've created the sample, how many bad ones there are, and you run it through, and there are 50 bad ones, but it only spots 10 of them. You got a problem, right? That would be the way to test the system, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but are the people that are corruptly stealing elections now.
Yeah.
Like the people that would be, you know what I mean? So that's the problem, is that the people in Maricopa County running these elections now, in my opinion, appear to be corrupt. And because of that, we can't trust anything that they say. So we are in a real quandary when it comes to that.
I think you're absolutely right. That's Tracy Beans, the editor of Uncover DC. We'll be back in a moment. We'll talk about how the FBI had 4 different investigations into the Clinton Foundation and Hillary Clinton herself, and then all of a sudden they get dropped mysteriously. We'll talk about it next on the show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday. Glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Emails go to talk@larslarson.com. You can vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show on Twitter, and then, of course, on our website at larslarson.com. Should the government notify you if a sex offender moves in next door? I've told you that there's a bill in my home state of Washington that was passed by both parties in the legislature that said anytime a predatory sex offender is going to be relocated into a neighborhood, those are called level 3 sex offenders, that the state should notify the people in the neighborhood. There's a level 3, that means he's going to be dangerous, pervert that's being moved into your neighborhood. And the governor vetoed that line in the bill, said, nope, we're not going to tell you when the level 3 sex offenders are coming to your neighborhood because public officials like to live behind the protection of men and women with guns and all kinds of security that's paid for by you. But you, the citizen, you don't get the same kind of protection. So should the government notify you if a sex offender is about to move in next door? I'd say yes. You can vote any way you like at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Now, I've occasionally had emails from some of you who listen to the show who said, Lars, you're asking these questions and they're too easy. I mean, who would support the idea of a sex offender moving in next door and not telling the people, the law-abiding people in the neighborhood about it? Well, I said, well, there's a governor who did it. There are lawmakers who do this. There are people on Capitol Hill and virtually every single state capital in America who support the idea of protecting the civil rights of the convicted pervert, pedophile, predator. And you say, so if you ask who would support such a crazy notion, most of them are Democrats. All of them are liberals. Anyway, the Twitter poll is brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined the group years and years ago. It was so good, and I think you should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better for you and better for America. Last week, I asked you, should parents call police on teachers who give students sexually inappropriate LGBTQ books? I said yes. So did 88% of you. Only 12% of you said no to that idea. Couple of things I want to mention. Senator Tim Scott, one of the country's most prominent black Republicans, kicked off his presidential campaign today. And here's what he said, one of my favorite quotes from it. Every single one of us are here because of an American journey where there were obstacles that become opportunities. But unfortunately, under President Biden, our nation is retreating away from patriotism and faith. Now, can you imagine Donald Trump and his VP choice being, say, Tim Scott? A powerful combination there, powerful ticket for Americans. Senator Tom Carper, Democrat of Joe Biden's state, Delaware, announced today he's not seeking re-election next year. He's going to retire from the Senate. The Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation has raised over $9 million in the fiscal year ending June 2022. That's an 88% decrease from the year before because I think a lot of the donors realized it was a giant scam to make money for a lot of the higher-ups at BLM. Staggering decline. They raised $80 million in the first year of 2020, and a lot of it went to the wrong purposes. Denver Museum of Nature and Science has chose to close its Native American exhibit because it reinforces white dominant culture. Yes, political correctness is even hitting the museum crowd. 866-439-5277. Naysayers go to the head of the line at 866-HEY-LARS. Should the Clinton Foundation investigations be reopened? Now, I think that's an easy yes. But the FBI had at least, there may be more, but at least 4 open criminal investigations into both Hillary and Bill Clinton. And all of a sudden, they were dropped in the months immediately before the 2016 election. Now, where did I get that information? The John Durham report that we talked about last week that was released. It showed that the FBI had all these investigations and just mysteriously dropped them right before Hillary Clinton was running for president in 2016. The feds had been looking into claims that foreign countries and individuals tried to influence the Clintons through donations to their namesake nonprofit, the Clinton Foundation. 3 out of the FBI's 4 investigations were launched in early 2016. They were looking at allegations that the Clinton Foundation was a hub of criminal activity, according, again, to the Durham report. The D.C. investigation was based on allegations that the Clintons accepted millions in donations from foreign governments. And at that point, I'd mentioned Uranium One. Do you remember that deal? I mean, it doesn't get brought up by the mainstream media very much, but in Uranium One, Hillary Clinton, as Barack Obama's Secretary of State, had decided to sign off on a deal that allowed a Russian company to eventually end up owning 20% of America's uranium reserves. And you say, why would we ever do that? Does that make sense to you? Well, the fact is, that there was a lot of money going to the Clintons. In fact, right after that deal was signed off on, Bill Clinton got paid $500,000 to give a single speech. $500,000, way above what Bill Clinton usually got paid to give a speech. The fourth investigation, according to the New York Post, made a well-placed source that said Hillary Clinton had continued to accept illegal donations throughout her presidential campaign. The foreign individual reportedly made a $2,700 contribution ahead of a campaign event, which led to another contribution of significant amounts of money. All four of the probes were dropped ahead of the 2016 election. Sounds like it's an awfully convenient way to ditch an investigation that might be politically troubling for Hillary Clinton, but no reason given for why they would drop the investigation at the same time that they were initiating criminal investigations into Donald Trump and those around him. Somehow, the FBI always seems to side with the Democrats and against Republicans. And if a federal agency is doing that, then Americans and our system of government are very much at risk. I got this email from Bill Williams, who wrote in, Lars, it's been claimed that the reason that marginalized minority students have such a high dropout rate and a low graduation rate is because schools in less affluent urban areas are underfunded. In 2 words, racial inequality. Many racial minorities succeed extraordinarily well in school, specifically Asian groups. So as long as we're talking numbers, let's compare attendance and absence records of Asian students with those of other minority groups. Dime to donuts, I'll bet there's a direct correlation between attendance and whether or not students graduate or drop out before they finish up. Signed, Bill Williams. Bill, thanks very much. Hey, are you a small business owner who could use a few $100,000? Employee retention tax credits, they're an incredible opportunity for you. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic. They've already helped out 1,500 small businesses, and those owners got about $300 million in funding. And they know what they're doing. They have a team of CPAs who specialize in filing those tax credits, and they're with you every step of the way, even if there's an audit. They stand behind their work with an audit safeguard. If you retain 5 or more W-2 employees during COVID, even if you already got the PPP money, you need to call Get My Funds now at 800-535-2950. And by the way, it's not a grant, it's not a loan, it's a tax refund. And there are no upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with the team you can trust at Get My Funds, 800-535-2950, or getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. Coming up on the Lars Larson Show, Democrats are still propping up 89-year-old Senator Dianne Feinstein, despite the fact that she was in the hospital for months. Is it time that American politicians had some term limits? We'll get to that next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday, and Joe Biden, I guess, is now negotiating with the Republicans, although he spent more than the last 3 months not negotiating. Not that that did us any good at all, but welcome back to the program. If you want to jump into the best conversation in talk journalism, it's 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, we put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Taffy Howard joins me now, South Dakota State Chair for U.S. Term Limits. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Lars. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well today. I have to admit to you that when my audience asks me about term limits, philosophically, I say, okay, I'm in favor of them, but I also see some hazards, mostly because I figure in Washington, D.C., like most power arrangements, if somebody loses power, you say, well, you're termed out. Mm-hmm. The power has to go somewhere. It's like a law of political physics. Like energy never disappears. It just changes form. So in that case, if we put term limits on politicians to try to rein them in, do we just end up transferring some of that power over to the federal bureaucracy, which has too much to begin with?
Oh, I don't think so. And you're exactly right. They have far too much power right now. So, but the ones that are in there right now, we have a uniparty in there. So The folks that are in D.C. right now aren't doing anything. Can it actually get worse? I don't really think it could so if we turn over, because I've seen this at the state level. I was a state legislator for 6 years. When you're new, you are not beholden to the lobbyists. You're not beholden. At the state level, you're not beholden to the governor. You are answering to your constituents.
Yep.
And what happens though, the longer you're there, the more you start kowtowing to the bureaucrats because you want to stay there, and they're the ones who hold the power. I will never forget my first year. We were fighting for, I don't remember the bill, but it was a good conservative bill. And this gal from my area who professed to be a conservative was fighting it. And I'm like, me and another gal walked up to her and said, "Why aren't you voting for this?" And she's like, "Taffy, nobody pays attention to how you vote. You say whatever you need to say to get elected, but when you come here, you vote the way you want to vote." And, sadly, too often she's right. A lot of voters aren't paying attention. We do need to wake up and realize what's going on. But I don't think things could get worse. And the turnover, I believe, would only help things in D.C. because right now they're all in it together. They're all in cahoots. We're hitting a debt ceiling here soon. Whose fault is that? It's all of their fault.
Well, Taffy, I want, by the way, before I forget to do this, I want you to mention where people can find U.S. term limits online, because inevitably I'll get calls or emails from people saying, "How do I get a hold of these folks?" And then I'll ask you something.
Yep. So you just go to the website, www.termlimits.com. We have a podcast every Monday that you can listen to, the No Uncertain Terms podcast. I would encourage people to go on there, sign the petition. It'll walk you through what exactly, lay out the procedure and everything. So people need to get involved. You need to fight for this at the state level and at the federal level.
Okay. Now, here's one concern I've got. Even if we have term limits, and I'm willing to go with those as long as we don't just transfer power to the bureaucracy, because as a freshman lawmaker, did you, and I think we can still call them freshmen, although the woke crowd will come after us eventually, and they will. But did you have the experience of saying, "Hey, I want to make a change in some part in South Dakota," and the bureaucrats would come in and say, "Well, clearly Taffy's new around here. She doesn't understand not just how decisions get made, but she doesn't have enough knowledge about how the bureaucracy works and how this agency works. So therefore, we're not even going to entertain these ideas." And it's only when you've been there long enough to know where the bodies are buried that you can come in and say, "Don't pull that stuff with me. I know how your agency works." But that takes some time, doesn't it?
Well, ideally, if you actually did that after you'd been there a while, that'd be great. But what happens, and I've seen this, it does not happen. So yes, you go in there and, oh my goodness, you have a great conservative bill and you think, oh, everybody's going to support this because this is a great bill. And you walk into committee and all of these state agencies show up to oppose you and you're like, what, why? I'll give you an example. So NPR, funding for NPR, public radio. I have always fought that. Don't want to give them any money, no taxpayer dollars. Yeah. So,
I'm with you.
So we had enough conservatives on appropriations, supposedly, that I thought we could at least 1 year just not give them the increase they wanted.
Right.
And I knew two guys that had been there forever, had opposed them before. And so I thought, well, if they're with me, then we've got the numbers and we can just not give them the increase. So I go up to these two guys who had fought funding for that in the past. And so I thought, surely they've been through this, they're ready to go. No, because now they've been in the trenches and they know that the bureaucrats play dirty and they want to get reelected and they know the bureaucrats have all the power. So unless those two needed to go. And unfortunately, while South Dakota has term limits, essentially we get around them. People flip-flop back and forth from each chamber. So they aren't too effective in our state, unfortunately, but they're better than nothing. So
okay, and should we have them at the federal level?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. But would that have to come through a constitutional amendment, or could it come through statute?
Yeah. Well, they could try it through statute, but we're attempting it through a constitutional amendment. So Representative Ralph Norman out of South Carolina has HJ 11, and Senator Ted Cruz has SJR 2 in the Senate. They each have, the House one has 96 co-sponsors, the Senate has almost 20. Sorry, I wish we had almost 50. So people need to call their representatives, their congressmen, and ask them to sign on as a co-sponsor for those bills. But the states can also do it. So that's why we're active in the states, because, the states can petition Congress and say, so if 34 states demand a constitutional convention on term limits, then they have to call one. So you can also push your state representatives to do the same thing at the state level.
You know what I'd like citizens to do in the meantime while working toward that?
Mhm.
I want them to say, what have you done outside of government? Because too often, if you want to be in Congress and maybe be in the Senate, maybe use that as a launch pad to then become governor and then run for president, you say, well, you start in your 20s and you run for the school board, then you run for the city council in a small town, and then you run for the state legislature, and then you move, and by the time they get to where they're going, even if they've only got 2 terms, they are so, I guess, obligated out to everybody who helped them to get to that spot and to get ahead that they say, oh, well, now I'm kind of own lock, stock, and barrel. If you came in the way Trump did, you came in the way other people from the private sector did and say, I've got a good job in the private sector, I'll do a couple of terms, and then I'll be happy to go back to my hometown and do my real job. That could do a lot of good. We citizens should start asking for that. That's Taffy Howard, the South Dakota chair for U.S. term limits. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday, and it now appears that one of America's biggest banks violated the Right to Financial Privacy Act and provided the FBI with a list of people who might have been involved in January 6th or might have just been in the area at the time. And I want to talk about the details of that. It's reporting by Breitbart.com, but this is huge because if the police or the FBI or any other law enforcement agency wants to be able to come and get information about you from a bank, the bank owes it to you. It has a fiduciary duty, not just to safeguard your money, but also to safeguard your privacy. And it appears that Bank of America may have actually violated that, and not for a good reason. I mean, after all, if a bank wants to answer a law enforcement agency and give them information with a subpoena, by all means. With a warrant, by all means. But without that, they should tell the FBI or the local police or even the local sheriff to go pound sand. At least that's my take. Glad to be with you on a Monday, and always glad to take your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. And naysayers, go first at 866-439-5277. You can send emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. And, of course, you can vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show and at LarsLarson.com tonight. And this seems like a simple question. If the government is about to release a predatory sex offender, and in this case, in the state of Washington, there was a law that was passed by both Republicans and Democrats. It went to the Democrat governor, Jay Inslee, who ran for president for about 10 seconds before he realized he was going to have even lower numbers than Jeb Bush had. And this is a Democrat governor, Jay Inslee. He said, I'm going to veto the part of the law that requires communities, including tribal sovereign nations, to get advance notice if a sexually violent predator is going to be relocated into that neighborhood or into that community. He vetoed it. He just said, I'm taking that part of the bill out. So, should the government notify you if a sex offender moves in next door? The poll question can be found at Lars Larson Show and at LarsLarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined, and you should too. It's very easy to do. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Now, last week, I asked you, should parents call the police on teachers who give students sexually inappropriate LGBTQ books? I said yes. So did 88% of you. Only 12% of you said no. So, welcome to the program. Glad to have you on board. Let me tell you more about the Bank of America, because this truly is disturbing. You know, whether you know it or not, if you put your money in a bank, they have a duty to safeguard that money. They also have a duty to safeguard your privacy. If somebody walks into your bank and says, hey, Lars is a buddy of mine, how much money does he have in his checking account? The bank is required to tell them it's none of your business. We're not even going to tell you that he is a customer at this bank, let alone anything else. And yet, consider this from Breitbart. A House Judiciary Committee report on FBI whistleblowers found the Bank of America provided the FBI with a list of anybody who had used their services, meaning debit card, credit card, wrote a check, any of that, in the Washington, D.C. area, regardless of whether or not they took part in the events of January the 6th. Now, we've talked about situations like this on the air before, where a mother and her daughter went to Washington, D.C., they listened to Donald Trump's speech, they left, they went to some other meetings, they were political meetings in D.C., they went nowhere near the Capitol building, and yet they were investigated. Consider this. Among the Judiciary Committee's many revelations, FBI whistleblowers Garrett O'Boyle and retired FBI Supervisory Intelligence Agent George Hill testified about how Bank of America gave the FBI's Washington field office a list of individuals who had made transactions in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia with a B of A credit or debit card between January 5th and January 7th, 2021. Now, is it any of their business? I travel to Washington, D.C. now and then. I go there sometimes for work, not very often for fun. I don't find Washington, D.C. a fun place to go to, and my wife and I have already done the museums and the history tours and all the rest of that. I do like the town of Charlottesville, Joe Thomas's town, WCHV, but Washington, D.C., I don't have much use for it. I wish it was half the size that it is. But they testified that individuals who had previously purchased a firearm with a Bank of America product were elevated to the top of the list provided to the FBI's Washington field office. Now, you say, well, if somebody owned a gun or bought some bullets and then they were in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, yeah, my answer would be, so what? Were they committing a crime? It is not a crime for a law-abiding citizen with a background check to buy a gun in America. It is not a crime to buy bullets. And yet, here's B of A sharing private financial information. I think B of A has some real explaining to do. Second item that I wanted to mention, the FBI, it turns out, has misused, and I would say they committed a crime, but they misused what is a digital surveillance tool, and they did it almost 300,000 times on January 6 suspects. The Post-Millennial reports that last Friday, a newly unsealed court document shows the FBI misused the Section 702 electronic database about 278,000 times between 2020 and 2021. Now, the agency blamed a misunderstanding between its employees and the Department of Justice. According to the Washington Post, the agency used the database against crime victims, January 6 riot suspects, rioters after the police killing of George Floyd, and 19,000 donors to one congressional candidate. The report comes as lawmakers are considering renewing the law that the database shares its name with, Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The report notes that one FBI employee ran more than 23,000 inquiries about Americans after the January 6th riot, even though there was no basis to assume the searches would actually find any foreign intelligence information. By the way, if aging muscles and joints are slowing you down, use what I use. Lars here for Gen Pop Extra Strength CBD Cream from Generic CBD. This stuff is amazing, folks. It's guaranteed to work or your money back. Rub it into your knees, your elbows, your shoulders, and your back, and especially your hands. It melts right into muscle and joints, and it goes to work fast. Plus, for me, it's a fantastic moisturizer for your hands when I've been out working in the yard. My wife and I love it. It's from our friends at Generic CBD, where you can save up to 75% on CBD. Not sold in the stores right now, but my listeners can get a trial-size bottle of 10 treatments for just $9.95. That's about a $20 value. And it's not a subscription. It's shipping is free, by the way. To order, go to rubitin.com. That's rubitin.com or call 740-RUB-IT-IN. That's 740-RUB-IT-IN. These products and statements have not been evaluated by the FDA, and these products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or illness. Back in just a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. From shady investigations into Donald Trump to questionable choices about Hillary Clinton, the FBI has become a political tool rather than a law enforcement agency. Is it time to give the FBI either a major overhaul or perhaps tear the agency down to zero and start over again? I thought I'd put that question to Dr. Curry Myers, who is a former sheriff and former state trooper, now a criminologist. Dr. Myers, welcome back.
Pleasure to be here again. Thank you so much.
I'm glad to have you. Is the rot so deep in the FBI that we cannot salvage the agency, or can we?
I think we can salvage the agency, but we have to have a significant reorganization. Unfortunately, this isn't the first time that the FBI has gone through that. If you look at I'm a history proponent of looking at history so that we don't make the same mistakes again. But ultimately, the FBI has become politically weaponized, and it's time to overhaul it. The scope of the mission, the organizational characteristics, and return it to its one-time greatest splendor as one of the finest investigative agencies in the world. But when Hoover took this over in 1924, everything was going pretty well until President Franklin Roosevelt took over in 1933. And in many ways that changed because he put all the federal government detective agencies under Hoover. And if you believe in the words of Edmund Burke, he once opined, the greater the power, the more dangerous the abuse. And we saw the political weaponization, not so much in the field, but in Washington, D.C. throughout the years of the 48 years in which Hoover had immense power. After his death, Congress realized that we can't have power under that one kind of person again, and so they put in an appointment process in addition to the presidential appointment. They had to have Senate confirmation, and they included a new 10-year term. But I make the argument that's still not enough. When Robert Mueller took over, we had some very fine directors of the KBI right after Hoover that went up until, in my opinion, Robert Mueller in 2001. And he immediately started to politicize the Bureau more. He brought out more outside staff into high-level positions. And that's in 2002, that's when he shifted the focus of the FBI from combating crime to more intelligence gathering. And I think ever since, if you look at the data and look at the history and look at the problems that have been associated with the FBI, it has been increasing and increasing ever since they've shifted from intelligence gathering to combating crime. And the difficult part is it's very dangerous to have an intelligence agency that has the powers of arrest.
Well, and do we need a domestic intelligence agency? Because it seems like that leads to trouble. If you say, in fact, Dr. Myers, I've heard it characterized this way, that if you're gathering criminal information on a crime, you have a crime like a murder, or rape, robbery, or some crime, you investigate that crime, you then decide to either prosecute it or not prosecute it, and there's an end date to it. With intelligence, you just gather intelligence constantly, and the more you gather, the more you want to gather, and it never stops. So it seems to lend itself to corruption because it means that as you're gathering that data, you're going to run into things that are useful to one side of the political aisle or damaging to the other side, and so you just keep gathering information. Should we have a domestic intelligence agency like a U.S. version of the CIA?
No, absolutely not. In fact, the founding fathers were terrified that federal organizations would become that, and that's one of the reasons why they didn't want to see a national police force. And in many ways, I wrote about this just recently on my Substack about this, is the FBI is kind of it's very powerful, but it's smaller. But when we decided about the same time period, when we shifted the FBI's mission, we decided, I think incorrectly, to start at one of the huge government bureaucracies of our time, and that's the Department of Homeland Security. Again, it doesn't take anything away from the hard work that the agents and staff do in the field every day, but I don't think the founding fathers ever envisioned the fact that we would have close to a nationalized police force in which the Department of Homeland Security is rivaling the Department of Defense in terms of manpower and budget and status. So it's getting bigger and bigger, and again, when you have these kinds of agencies, it's difficult to keep them in line. You have mission and scope issues. You have mission creep issues that occur, command and control issues, and that's the reason I think we have 7 solutions that we need to look at there. I hope Congress looks at, and not just looks at, but takes serious pause and looks at these opportunities for improvement. And the first one is mission and scope. What should they be doing? Should we go back to the originality of the FBI's mission, which is to focus on violent crime, organized crime, white-collar crime, cybercrime, and then counterterrorism? Mission creep, that mission creep continues to occur with any organization, so there needs to be guardrails and limitations in place to keep the FBI from exceeding their statutory authority. And then command and control. The FBI has been weaponized mainly because of headquarters. I think they ought to follow the U.S. Marshals organizational status, which it means that they do have a director of the U.S. Marshal Service, but most of the power rests with the presidential appointments of U.S. Marshals that are in the 94 judicial districts, United States judicial districts throughout the United States. And when you had that, you would have operational authority in those districts, and it would be difficult for another district or Washington, D.C. headquarters to come in and usurp the work that's being done by those federal marshals in that district.
Or step across the lines.
Needs to be looked at.
Dr. Myers, I don't remember if you're the one who mentioned this to me, so if you were, please thank you for that. But there was a point after January 6th where the FBI's D.C. office reached out, I believe, to the Boston office, and they said, we'd like to know anybody and everybody who was on a bus or a train that came from Boston to Washington, D.C. during that time period, Jan 5 to Jan 7 or 8 or 12. And even the Boston office of the FBI said, hold on, why do you want this? Well, we just want to see who was here, who traveled here. Well, it's not illegal to travel there. It might have been illegal to break things or break into the U.S. Capitol, but it's not illegal to go to the Capitol for a political rally. And so the Boston office pushed back, and I guess they pushed back hard enough that they shut down the request altogether. But nothing happened after that. So you had an agency trying to just gather data on Americans who were merely traveling, which is a constitutional right, and only because somebody in the Boston office said, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to get involved in that unless you're doing a specific investigation of somebody who may have broken the law. But it sounds like the FBI doesn't have enough of those people. We only have a few whistleblowers right now, and most of the rest of the agency is staying silent.
Yeah, we have way too many cases that are being developed by Washington, D.C. headquarters staff, and they're being pushed down to the FBI agents in the field. And thank goodness we have a lot of FBI agents in the field. Not a lot, but we have a lot that are concerned. I will tell you that. But we have an unusual amount of whistleblowers, which is, when you think about it, people are poo-pooing on the left. They're poo-pooing the number of whistleblowers that we're having, but it's quite a few. You're talking about FBI agents that are dedicated to their mission. They take an oath of office, and you have this many FBI agents that are willing to whistleblow on the fact of improper work that's being done by the FBI. This is cause for concern. But we have too many cases that are being run out of Washington, D.C., and that includes the U.S. Attorney's Office out of Washington, D.C. They are far too much involved in cases that are throughout the United States, and that's not the way the United States Department of Justice intended things to work. It leads to centralized management, centralized control, and those are huge problems. And then you
Absolutely.
Deal with the FBI. The FBI has one thing in their pocket that a lot of people forget, and they have the ability to arrest people for making false statements to federal investigators.
Yep.
That is used a lot, and I think we should limit subjective FBI charges if it's not material to the underlying investigation.
Then you don't get the information. Dr. Myers, thank you very much. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. I laugh when I hear that one. Glad to take your calls, too, at 866-HEY-LARS. And naysayers, you always go first at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. I want you to think about something. We've mentioned it before on the show. But Joe Biden has been the biggest and worst aider and abetter of human trafficking and child trafficking in the world. I don't think there's anybody else on this planet who has aided and abetted more human trafficking than Joe Biden has. And you say, well, what do you mean by that, Lars? And I say, well, number one, the current count is about 9 million people who have been brought into the United States. The cartels in Mexico have been making massive amounts of money on this, and anything they make money on, legal or not, is something that they're going to be more involved in, and they have been doing a huge amount of human trafficking. Now, some of it does involve people who are simply coming across the border illegally to work illegally to send money back to what they really see as their home country. That's bad enough. But then you have children who are being brought across the border by adults who portray their parents, but they are not the parents of those children. And there was a way that the U.S. government had to find that out. DNA testing. If they do DNA testing, so somebody is coming into the country illegally, and they say, why, this is my wife and I and our 2 children. And when you DNA test them and you find out, well, a huge number of those kids turn out to not be related at all to the illegal aliens who are bringing them across. And if you say, well, why would 2 adults or an adult bring a child illegally across the U.S. border? And the answer is primarily for something illegal. It could be pornography. It could be sexual abuse. It could be a lot of very ugly things. Not a single one of them is a positive for that child, and not a single one of them is a positive for the United States. But consider this. Our friend John Solomon at Just the News reports the Biden administration is set to end familial DNA testing at the U.S.-Mexico border. What does that mean? Familial, as in family, they test the purported mom and dad, then they test the children. And they say, you say these are your children, DNA says otherwise. That has been one of the keys to preventing the fraudulent entry of many illegal aliens and to stop child trafficking, according to a memo obtained by Just the News. The DNA testing was originally implemented under Donald Trump and then used by Customs and Border Protection. In fact, I'd step away from John's story for a moment to say this. I believe that Donald Trump was the single most effective president when it came to cracking down on child trafficking, on sex trafficking, even of adult men and women, of young boys and girls. He was the most effective. And if you don't believe that, show me what Joe Biden did about it. Show me what George W. Bush or George Herbert Walker Bush did about human trafficking. Show me what Bill Clinton would have done about human trafficking, and then compare any and all of that to what was done by Donald Trump. Now, here's what happened. There was a court order related to the separation of migrant children from their families and evidence that the drug cartels were using kids to create fake family units to sneak illegal aliens across the border. And why does that work? It sounds like the cartels who are involved in all this illicit traffic, human beings, drugs, violence, the whole 9 yards. And you say, oh, hold on. Why would they bring across or send across a man, a woman, and 2 kids? Because on American television, the cartels seem to be aware that the way you present the people coming in can generate a tremendous amount of sympathy. Because what do the TV networks do? Without even inquiring, they simply go out and they shoot video of a lot of men and women, reasonably well-dressed, cleaned up, and then a child or 2 or 3. And to American families watching at home, unless there is more information put with that video, it looks really sympathetic. You say, well, there's a mom and dad, and they're trying to get their kids to a better place by breaking the law, of course. But that's something that you'll get a lot of sympathy for. If you said, no, that's an adult man and a woman he barely knows, and 2 kids they're not even related to, and they're simply sending them across as a family unit. And, of course, there's the side issue, and that was that during the campaign for president, Joe Biden, right on the debate stage, accused Donald Trump of putting kids in cages. Donald Trump did not put kids in cages. And, by the way, the cages were created by the Obama-Biden administration long before Donald Trump ever announced that he was running for president. And why did they do that? And I've told people this is easy to understand. If in your town, no matter where you are in America, if the police go to a place where criminal activity is going on, like a drug lab, a drug house, anything that involves criminal activity, if they find adults and children, they arrest the adults if they're to be arrested, and they charge them, or they're charged by the DA. The kids are taken into the custody of the state and handed off to children's services. And at some point, they may in fact be reunited with the adult parents, if the adult parents don't end up going to jail or to prison. Otherwise, the children are put into the care of the state, and in most cases, the state tries to do right by the kids, return them to other family members and the like. Over the weekend, a Customs and Border Protection memo sent out to frontline border agents announced the testing will cease when its vendor's contract expires this month. CBP has identified numerous family fraud attempts by illegal aliens over the year. For example, in 2022, a Government Accountability Office report found that as many as 1 in 10 children tested turned out not to be related at all to the illegal aliens who are coming across with them. Other reports found as many as 30% of these suspected migrant fraud families had no family relationship whatsoever based on DNA, which means, think about this, there have been people who've been threatened with prison in America, and there have been people who have gone to prison in America for lying to federal authorities. When illegal aliens come across the border and they're intercepted by a federal agency, Customs and Border Protection, and they lie to CBP, or they lie to ICE, or they lie to the local sheriff or the local police department, if they're lying to federal investigators, that is a crime. We've sent people like Martha Stewart off to prison for lying to the FBI. General Mike Flynn was threatened with prison for allegedly lying to the FBI. And yet illegal aliens get away with it, no problem whatsoever. If that seems right to you, by all means, call as a naysayer at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a small business owner, could you use a few $100,000 right now? Employee retention tax credits, they're an incredible opportunity for you. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic. They've already helped out 1,500 small businesses, and the owners of those businesses got about $300 million in funding. And they know what they're doing. They have a team of CPAs who specialize in filing for those tax credits, and they're with you every step of the way, even if there's an audit. They stand behind their work with an audit safeguard at Get My Funds. If you retained 5 or more W-2 employees during COVID, and even if you already got the PPP money, you need to call Get My Funds, and do it now at 800-535-2950. It's not a grant, it's not a loan, it's a tax refund. And there are no upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with a team you can trust at Get My Funds at 800-535-2950 or getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. Coming up, the federal government's out-of-control spending has driven deficits and debt to unsustainable highs. Should the lawmakers raise the debt ceiling as Joe Biden proposes? Talk about it next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Well, as you know, I believe Joe Biden deserves all of the blame, although he said as recently as this weekend he deserves none of the blame whatsoever for the fact that America now sits at the edge of the abyss known as the debt ceiling limit. Pete Earle joins me now, who's an economist at the American Institute for Economic Research. Pete, what should we do to resolve all this? Because Joe Biden spent over 100 days saying, I won't negotiate. And he's the same guy who, as a senator and as a VP, had said, you always have to negotiate on the debt ceiling. And then he just refused to do it as president. Now it appears he is negotiating, although I'm not sure if it's in good faith. Give me your view of all this.
Well, I'll tell you, and good to be back.
Thank you, sir.
I have to say that I'm surprised by a lot of the rhetoric that's coming out because it's at direct odds with what we see is happening. I mean, we know from the meeting tonight when McCarthy came out, when Biden came out, Biden said, well, you know, we need to make some cuts, and they've already agreed to let certain COVID funding lapse. So right there, that sort of gets away from the Biden requirement that only a clean bill right? Only a clean bill will pass, or only a clean lifting of the ceiling will pass. So they've already gone back on their word there. So it's kind of a question of looking at the facts and believing what we're being told, which of course with this administration and with many administrations, it's never a good idea to just take what they say on faith.
All right, but when you say that, it's like the little bit pregnant business where you say you can't be a little bit pregnant. If he says, I will take only a clean debt ceiling limit, you're right. Now that he's broken that barrier, now we can go and do other things. But Pete, for the life of me, I can't understand how Joe thinks it's defensible to say, we shoveled out all this COVID cash for an emergency that is now over, but we'd like to leave all that cash out there instead of clawing it back and saying, if you didn't actually need it to meet the needs of the emergency, then it comes back to the Congress, back to the Treasury. How could they ever defend the idea of not bringing that money back as one of the items I know Republicans have been pursuing?
Yeah, well, the COVID aid programs have really been helpful for the Biden administration because, they're expiring sort of in a feathered fashion. 1 month and then 2 months later another, 3 months later another, and the first few that expired are the basis upon which the Biden administration claimed that they were reducing the deficit. They weren't reducing the deficit. They simply weren't fighting the expiry of some of these COVID programs. So. Despite the fact that these things are still going on, I mean, look, the Biden administration benefits from the extension of all this crisis, payment and the appearance of these things, still going on. I mean, they would never have admitted that it was over at the end of the last administration. They wanted to keep it going so they could make it seem like they ended it, and that's what we're seeing right now. They don't want these things to end because they want to be able to claim in a year or two that they cut the deficit.
Yeah, and so they'll just let them expire over a period of time. Yep. The second issue, and I brought it up to my audience, I've said it seems reasonable to say if you are on Medicaid, insurance funded by taxpayers for the poor, depending on how you define the poor. And some of those definitions are the poverty level, 2 times the poverty level, 3 times the poverty level. But you're having other Americans pay for the health insurance for those people. And the ask from the Republicans is, can you tell them to work a part-time job or at least be in training for a job? How does Joe Biden say that's not reasonable to tell otherwise unemployed people, if you want free stuff, you have to go out and work a job? And yet the president sticks by that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not 30 years ago where we had a Democratic president who actually was willing to negotiate that point and actually was willing to close some of those restrictions. So what you see in that is sort of the creep that happens over time in politics. I mean, things that formerly were viewed as negotiable, things that were formerly viewed as just sort of fair play, are now viewed as unthinkable. It really comes down to one word, and that is entitlements. The encroaching spreading of entitlements, the expansion of those definitions, that's really cost us an arm and a leg. I mean, it's going to bankrupt us eventually.
All right, so do you think Joe will give on that one? And if not, which constituency is he trying to satisfy with that one? Because as you pointed out, in the 90s, the Republican Congress and Bill Clinton eventually got together on welfare reform and said, this can't be a lifetime program, and we think it's better if you go out and get some things going on your own. And I've always told people, if you want a full-time job, a great place to start is a part-time job. They often lead to full-time jobs if you're willing to actually put some effort in.
And the thing is that today we don't even have to go with a part-time job. We have the whole gig economy, which didn't exist 10 years ago. You can work a job and make a certain amount of money at certain hours. So, a lot of the arguments that, I don't have time, or, I have to wait for my kids to get home from school. A lot of people can work in the gig economy around those. So there's actually less holding people from earning some sort of a living than there was even 10 or 15 years ago. Now, you asked, what's going to be, I think you asked me what where the line is here, what Joe's going to give on.
Yeah.
I think that they will eventually come to a deal. I think one of two things is going to happen. The first thing I think is possible is they'll come to a deal, but both sides, especially the administration, will lie through their teeth about what was accomplished. That's the first thing. I mean, we've seen this administration say there's 0% inflation, and inflation is worse everywhere else. Blame, gas station owners. I mean, there's no bottom to the depths they'll sink to sort of market their failures as successes. Another option is, of course, to kick the can down the road and for the two sides to say, okay, listen, we're going to come back to the table in 8 months, 10 months, and we agree, we'll raise the debt ceiling now, but you have to come up with, say, 3/4 or 9/10 of what we would have wanted this time in terms of cuts. And then that will almost inevitably lead to another crisis of this sort. So, the treadmill is speeding up. It's getting harder and harder to stay, ahead of these fiscal cycles.
Yeah, it is, and that pushes it into next year's election, doesn't it?
Yep, it sure does. Yep, it sure does.
And is Joe Biden going to be willing to do that?
I mean, again, I think he will, whether he winds up, completely giving in or whether he winds up getting some or all of what he wants, he's going to claim it's a victory. And, they've already called for hearings on some of these cuts. And you know what they're going to do? They're going to get people up there, and they're just going to blame them for hating the poor and for, all these other things. I mean, it's a dog and pony show. It would be very similar to what happened with the January 6th hearings.
I got to tell you, Pete, the idea that you hate the poor because you want them to be capable of earning their own living, and you're not asking much, you're still getting a ton of help from federal and state agencies, and could you please work a job, and maybe it'll turn into something full-time and well-paid, and you say that's hating the poor? I just can't wrap my head around that one. That's Pete Earle, who is an economist with the American Institute for Economic Research. Your calls are welcome at 866-HEY-LARS, and you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Are you part of the Great Resignation, that mass exodus of people who are leaving their jobs to start something new? Then something you need to consider is what to do with your company 401k. Rather than just rolling it over, consider opening a truly self-directed IRA. With a self-directed IRA, a truly self-directed IRA, your retirement portfolio can include real estate, precious metals, cryptocurrency, notes, loans, a new business, and traditional equities like stocks and bonds. You can make any investment the law allows with a truly self-directed retirement account. Listen, you probably have questions, so why not take the time to get the answers? Start with going to IRAadvantage.com. Then talk to the truly self-directed IRA professionals at IRA Advantage.
Would you like to learn more about truly self-directed IRAs? Then visit IRAadvantage.com, view our videos, and call IRA Advantage. Let us set up a truly self-directed IRA for you. That's IRAadvantage.com.
Would you be blameless in a default situation?
On the merits, based on what I've offered, I would be blameless. On the politics of it, no one will be blameless. And by the way, that's one of the things that some are contemplating. I actually had, I got to be careful here. I think there are some MAGA Republicans in the House who know the damage that it would do to the economy. And because I am president and presidents are responsible for everything, Biden would take the blame, and that's the one way to make sure Biden's not reelected.
And that was Joe Biden answering questions from Peter Doocy from Fox News. And what they were talking about is this debt ceiling crisis where America has been walked up to the edge of a cliff. Now, maybe, I've been telling people myself, as much as I know about the situation, I don't think that they are going to cause America to go over that cliff, because going over that cliff is where America formally defaults on its national debt. Let me talk about that in just a moment and what Joe Biden has done. But take note of the fact, this is the President of the United States. Presidents have famously said since Harry Truman, the buck stops here. And yet here's Joe Biden saying, no, on the merits, I'm blameless. Let me tell you why Joe Biden has walked this country to this cliff, and I think he has done America a dirty trick. But before we do that, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. If you want to take part in the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And, of course, you can vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find that every day with a brand new question at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and on my website at larslarson.com. And welcome to the Radio Northwest Network, proudly serving the Pacific Northwest states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho for the past 23 and a half years. We're glad to be with you. Now, about what Joe Biden was saying. Here's Joe Biden. He wants to abuse the Constitution again by trying to use the 14th Amendment as a way around the Constitution to get America's debt ceiling lifted. And I want to point out to you, this president has chosen to not negotiate on this for the last more than 3 months. It is more than 100 days that when the Republicans said, look, we've got the debt ceiling coming up, we may go into formal default as soon as the 1st of June, maybe push it back 2 weeks. We have known this for more than 3 months. So if you say, well, what's going on here? America has borrowed more than $31 trillion. That is a gargantuan amount of money. The amount of interest we pay on the national debt alone is billions of dollars per day. It's getting to be such a large number, and with interest rates up because of Joe Biden's mishandling of the economy, inflation has gone up, interest rates have gone up. And because of that, the amount of money as our short-term national debt rolls over, about a third of it rolls over on a short-term basis, and that'll happen this year, the next few years. We're going to pay a lot of money to roll over short-term debt. And all of this because of Joe Biden. So he says, I want an increase in the debt ceiling. Now, as a senator and as a vice president, Joe Biden has been very clear. You have to negotiate on the debt. All of a sudden, he finds himself this bumbling Iran from the basement candidate who becomes president of the United States. And he says, I'm not negotiating on anything. So he effectively lied to the public by saying you always have to negotiate on the debt until he's in the position to negotiate. And then for 100 days, he thought he could lay down an ultimatum. The Constitution says the only way you can spend money if you're the federal government is if a law called an appropriation is passed by the Congress, and then the president can sign it or he can veto it. Joe Biden has got the very clear message from Republicans who've said this, and I've told you this before, that my view of it, if you want to take it to a personal level, you have a friend or a family member or your son and daughter who come to you and say, Dad or Mom, I've run myself into so much debt, I can't even make the minimum payments. The creditors they're going to kick me out of my house or my apartment. They're going to take my car. They're going to turn off my credit cards. I'm in big trouble. Will you bail me out? And a reasonable parent would say, I will bail you out, but you have to change the way you're spending money. You have to modify your lifestyle. You've been living beyond your means. We need to do that with the federal government, which has lived beyond its means almost its entire existence. Well, here's Joe Biden who says, I don't want to change the way we spend money. And he understands the only time that Congress has the leverage to be able to say, Mr. President, you need to cut spending. And they wanted to do a couple of fairly simple things. The major things. Now, there are a lot of other details, but these are the major items that would save us money. Number one, Congress shoveled out about 2.5 years ago, a massive amount of money to state and local governments during the COVID pandemic. Whether for right or wrong, they shoveled the money out. Much of that money has not even been spent, and we're well past the emergency. So it would be, again, I'll compare it to your son or daughter. Your son or daughter comes to you and says, Dad, I'm having an emergency. I'm trapped in a foreign country. I need an airplane ticket to get home. So dad or mom sends $1,000 or $2,000, wires it or whatever. And the kid gets home and you say, did you have to spend all that money we sent you to get the ticket? No, I got a really good deal. But I'd like to keep all the extra money you gave me, even though you sent me money during an emergency. I handled the emergency and I didn't spend all the money. But can't I just keep the extra? Joe wants to let state and local governments that haven't even spent the so-called COVID emergency money hang on to that money. That's one item. Item number two, Republicans say they'd like to see work requirements, which are already in the law, but Joe Biden has to actually make it happen. They want to see him say, if you're on Medicaid, which is insurance for poor people, you've got to go out and get at least a part-time job. That is not an extraordinary requirement. That will save over $100 billion all by itself. If you're on welfare, if you're on TANF or temporary aid to needy families, if you're on food stamps, you need to go out and seek and find at least a part-time job, 20 hours a week. That is not unreasonable. Joe Biden has now said that he wants to go around the Congress that is the only body in the Constitution allowed to appropriate money and approve of its spending. And he says he doesn't have to because of the 14th Amendment. And what they do is they take a line out of the 14th Amendment and they edit the middle of the line out. The line is, the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. And Joe says that means I can create public debt without an act of Congress. Let me read the whole line to you. The validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion. This was written right after the Civil War. That's what they were talking about, shall not be questioned. Now, think about that. Joe Biden is going to try and use something that says you're not going to question the amount of debt we have, as long as it was passed by law, which means the Congress has to agree to it. He said he won't negotiate with the Congress. He has driven us right to the edge of a cliff, and now he wants to push America over the cliff with all of the bad consequences that will come from defaulting on the debt. Joe Biden is dead wrong, and yes, he is not blameless at all. Glad to take your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to take your phone calls and emails. I'm kind of amazed, frankly, and maybe Jack Brown, the attorney from Pacific Legal, saying, Lars, you're just acting naive, that so much illegal stuff is going on. We talk about it almost every day on this show, and I'm not a lawyer like he is, but should I be amazed that there are so many institutions that just seem to flout the law? You got a president who says, we're going to make everybody get a jab, and we'll do it through OSHA rules. And then the courts have to say, Joe, you can't do that. We're going to forgive everybody's student debt. And the courts say, nah, that's probably not going to happen either. You're not acting within the law. And then we have UC Santa Cruz as an example of one of America's colleges that says, hey, guess what? We're going to go out and we're going to actively discriminate in hiring of people at a public university. And they're going to have to get dragged into court to get them set straight. Is that about what it adds up to?
That's about right. Yeah, the UC Santa Cruz is imposing a DEI statement requirement to apply for university jobs. So if you want your application to even be considered, you have to fill out this DEI statement. And, if you want to get a high score, you need to, express agreement with a specific set of political beliefs, which is an unconstitutional condition under the First Amendment.
Well, and Jack, just so people understand, if your boss comes to you, a private sector boss, and says, hey, anybody who comes to work here, has to do certain things, has to say certain things, a boss can do that in the private sector. But the government is specifically forbidden against imposing, mandating speech by citizens. Isn't that the case?
That's correct. Yeah. Even if so the government is not allowed to condition the receipt of a government benefit on you surrendering your constitutional rights. Basically, the government's not allowed to leverage you or induce you to do something that they're not allowed to make you do. So one of the things they can't do is, force you to, and that's true even if you're not entitled to the government benefit. So, we're not arguing that our client, in this case, J.D. Haldigan, is entitled to a position at UC Santa Cruz. We're simply arguing that he should be able to apply for this job without being forced to express ideas with which he disagrees. The government's not allowed to induce you to agree with a specific set of political beliefs just to get university employment.
And actually, Jack, doesn't this extend all the way down? I mean, I remember watching a lawyer stand up in front of I think it was the city council in California. No, it was a school board. And he said, look, folks, you start telling teachers they've got to subscribe to pronoun ideas, they got to subscribe to DEI or CRT or any of the rest of this stuff, you're going to find yourself in court and you're going to lose, because mandated speech in a lot of cases that came out of the Cold War and the attempt by government to force people to sign loyalty or to speak loyalty oaths, all that's already been decided. So do you have any inkling as to why the UC Santa Cruz is thinking that they can get away with this when their own in-house counsel is probably telling them, hey, this one got decided 50, 70 years ago. You're not going to be able to do this?
Well, I certainly don't think they learned their lessons from the Cold War, because this DEI statement requirement is, disturbingly, similar to those anti-communist loyalty oaths. And, the Supreme Court held that was unconstitutional back then. And, if it comes down to it, a court of law is going to hold that these are unconstitutional now. They're playing with fire here.
So where does this case go? Where does it stand, and where is it going?
Well, we've only just filed the case, so we're waiting on the defendant's answer. But we hope that by filing this case, that it will encourage more people like Mr. Haldigan or Dr. Haldigan, who, are deeply concerned about the negative impacts that these DEI statement requirements have on people's First Amendment rights, will be more willing to step forward. It's been a real problem within the academic space that people are afraid to stand up for their rights, and we're hoping that more people will be encouraged to come forward.
Well, see, I hope so too, because, Jack, I think that all these school districts, whether it's a public school district at the local level, that's a government agency or they're government entities, and you've got public universities like UC Santa Cruz, that once it gets decided, even though they haven't apparently paid attention to their counsel's advice up till now, that maybe the taxpayers are going to say, stop wasting probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, fighting legal cases where you already know up front you're going to lose. Otherwise, you're just wasting our money instead of educating kids.
Oh, for sure. And yeah, I mean, one of the things that that JD was concerned about is that these sorts of requirements are deleterious to an educational environment. They cast, as the Supreme Court would say, a pall of orthodoxy over the classroom, and that's not a good learning environment for anyone. One of the things that I always valued growing up was getting a variety of different perspectives on a variety of issues, and I think that helped me grow as a person. So not only is what the university doing unconstitutional, but it also, harms its mission as an institution to provide the best education possible.
Well, it's funny, too, because one little twist to this case is that constitutional rights apply to, it's a limit on our government. So even though J.T. Haltigan is a professor at the University of Toronto, because he's applying for a job at UC Santa Cruz, he has the right to say this government agency, UC Santa Cruz, cannot engage in this kind of behavior. And I can't recall from the background in this case, is he a Canadian or is he an American? But the rights apply one way or the other.
American. He's an American. He works remotely at the University of Toronto, but he is in fact an American. So, but yeah, you're absolutely right. The Constitution exists to limit government. It reduces the government's power. It limits the government's power in a variety of ways, whether it be through protecting constitutional rights or through its structure. And it's designed to prevent the university from doing exactly what it's doing here, which is force people to express ideas with which they disagree.
Hey, Jack, are there any other students at UC Santa Cruz having any kind of reaction one way or the other to this?
Not that I've seen. We shall see. But I'm looking forward to seeing how things develop.
Well, I guess I just wish, as a citizen, I don't pay California taxes. I don't live in California. I did when I was a little kid. But I wish the public got more excited about this when some institution, whether it's, a high school in Bremerton, Washington, that tries to tell a coach he can't say a prayer to himself on the 50-yard line after the ball game, whether it's a university that says, we're going to make you take a loyalty oath to DEI and CRT and all that. That is Jack Brown. He's an attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation. Bottom line of this, UC Santa Cruz effectively wants to force anybody applying for a job to sign a loyalty oath. And I think that's crazy. Hey, are you a small business owner who could use a few $100,000? Well, employee retention tax credits, they're an incredible opportunity. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic, and they've already helped out more than 1,500 small businesses to get about $300 million in funding. Imagine how that would help your business. And and they know what they're doing. They've got a team of CPAs who specialize in filing for these tax credits, and they're with you every step of the way, even if there's an audit. Get My Fund stands behind their work with an audit safeguard. If you retained 5 or more W-2 employees during COVID, and even if you already got the PPP money, you need to call Get My Funds now at 800-535-2950. It's not a grant. It's not a loan. It's a tax refund. And there are no upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with a team you can trust at Get My Funds at 800-535-2950 or getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. Glad to get your calls in a moment, including perhaps a naysayer at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And you're listening to the Radio Northwest Network. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday. It's my pleasure to be with you. And if you want to jump into the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Our promise of more than a quarter century that if you're a naysayer, we put you right to the head of the line. Still there, 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com and be sure to vote in our Twitter poll. That's free, although it may be habit forming. You find it at Lars Larson Show. Now, I want to tell you something. There was a time when I very much admired the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, not because of TV or movies or anything like that, but because I thought, number one, we need to have an investigative agency that goes across state lines, and number two, I thought they had a reasonably good track record. But lately, I don't trust the FBI. If they showed up at my door, I just indicate I'm not talking to you without an attorney present. And that's even though I don't think I've committed any crimes. I think the FBI could find a crime if they wanted to because they've shown that capability recently. Deborah Saunders is a journalist and a syndicated columnist available at Digging In with Deborah J. Saunders on Substack. Deborah, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Lars.
Can we trust the FBI?
No. I mean, I have to tell you something. I read the 306-page Durham report, and it made it clear that not only did the FBI do things it shouldn't be doing, but agents knew it. They understood that they had a flimsy case, that they're supposed to be careful. If they're going to investigate people during an election, they're supposed to have cause, real cause, and that they shouldn't just go in and look like they're knocking around the furniture everywhere. But that's exactly what they did. They took flimsy things. They found, for example, we know George Papadopoulos had drinks with a British ambassador, a diplomat, and he said to him the Russians have information on Trump. That's it. That was the basis for starting this investigation. Nothing particular, no real information, no mention of the Kremlin, no mention of people in the Trump campaign. That's what started it. And later on, Carter Page was brought up after the Steele dossier, which we all remember, after that was released. They went after Carter Page. And again, did they reach out to Carter Page and George Papadopoulos? No. Carter Page sent a note to the FBI offering to be interviewed, and they didn't talk to him for months. Instead, they went after him. This is one of the most outrageous things I have seen in my career, and I've seen a lot of outrageous things in my career.
Well, Deborah, let me ask you this, though. Usually things will come up, and sometimes it starts a sort of a national conversation, and people say, "Oh, well, we should do something about that." I don't hear much evidence of that national conversation of people saying, "Well, hold on, is this agency so fatally flawed that we should essentially tear it down to zero, like taking a building right down to the flat land and rebuilding it completely because it's so fatally flawed?" But I'm not hearing that national conversation driven by either side of the aisle.
Well, you're so right. And what blew my mind as I'm reading the report was I'm watching cable news, I'm watching a bunch of different stations, and a number of people said there was nothing in this report. And that's just not true. This report really got into details about how there were FBI agents and other intelligence officials who were saying, this is not right. This does not predicate an investigation of a presidential candidate. And they were saying it, and they were ignored. And there were people who knew what was going on, and they just pushed it because they wanted to get Trump. This was, I was there in Trump Tower in January of 2017 when Trump came out before he took the oath of office and talked about wiretapping, that the FBI had been surveilling him. It was hard to believe, but he was right. He was right on this. They misused their authority, their power, and if they will do it to Donald Trump or any presidential candidate, they'll do it to anybody. They're not going to. If they think that they're right or that they don't like you, they're going to do it. And that's the thing that just scared me. I've always been pro law enforcement.
So have I.
But this is a bureaucracy that is drunk with power and out of control.
Okay, but let me ask you something else. I'm talking to Deborah J. Saunders, who's digging in with Deborah Saunders on Substack. Great place to read things and her columns and her work in particular. But what explains why, when the FBI does this, unless you may have an example to the contrary, it always augurs in favor of the Democrat Party and always augurs against the Republican Party? Is that just a happy accident for the Democrats? Or is something else going on that would explain why I have some theories, but why the FBI would always be doing this kind of thing, capable of doing this even over the strongest objections? Boss, why are we doing this? And that it always works in favor of the Democrats. Why is that? Why is it working out that way? Because there are agencies that, like regulatory agencies that go out and they just regulate, everybody, and everybody kind of gets a piece of the pain. But this one goes out after one side and then ignores the other side, like Hillary Clinton. I know people are going to say, Lars, you're trying to be a victim. That your side is always getting the bad calls from the ref. No, I don't think that's my imagination. Is it?
No, it's not your imagination. We know that we know that the reason that this worked is because the media went along with it. Let me just back up for a second. I was talking about being there in Trump Tower when the dossier came out, and up until that point, there had not been, up until that 24-hour period, that dossier had been shopped to a number of major news organizations. Their reporters could not verify anything in it, basically. So no reputable news organization would touch it. And then Michael Isikoff of Yahoo News runs it, and then it's off to the races. Lars, in journalism, it's better to be wrong in the pack than right all by yourself.
Yep.
And here's the example of it. There were all these people who knew better, and they knew better, Lars, but they couldn't help themselves. It was a feeding frenzy, and once that starts, you just can't. Everybody wants to get some stupid scoop, and I'm sorry, there were a lot of stupid scoops in this, where I learned this new development, and I'm going to go with it. And whether or not it's a good investigation, it falls by the wayside because people wanted so much to get Trump. And so if federal authorities overreach in a way that hurts the left, they're going to get clobbered. But if they overreach in a way that hurts corporations or conservatives, I'm sorry, that's not the worst thing for them. Oh, can I mention one thing? I'm a senior fellow with the Discovery Institute.
Oh, I should mention that because that's a good outfit. And we talk to people from Discovery. But here's the other piece of it. Deborah, I don't know about you, but when I was a reporter, I loved to be the contrarian. Not just to be a contrarian, but when I'd say, the whole pack's going that way, I'm going to go this way. And I got a lot of heat from my boss. He'd say, hey, everybody else's story talked about this, and yours is off over here on some other aspect of this. And I said, yeah, that's where the story is. And that's actually good journalism is that way. You read the New York Times version, then you read the Wall Street Journal or whatever, and you say, oh, they're very different stories about the same thing. That to me, that was a highlight of doing the job, was being able to say, yeah, everybody else is telling the same darn story, and I'm going to tell you something you never heard in those other stories, and it's going to wow you. Except that doesn't seem to be present in journalism anymore. I'll give you the last 30 seconds.
You're so right. I was thinking on the Wayback Machine myself about the times when I'd be covering a story a lot of other people were covering, and getting something that they didn't get was a badge of honor.
Yep.
But with this story, they treated you like you were a freak.
Yeah, in fact, to the point where during the pandemic, if you said, hey, maybe it came out of the lab. No, that's already been debunked. Maybe the vaccine is safe. Maybe it's not. Yeah, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. And if you question what's going on in Ukraine, hundreds of billions of dollars to a notoriously corrupt country, What could possibly? You're a Putin stooge. Deborah J. Saunders' work can be found at Digging In with Deborah J. Saunders on Substack. Deborah, it's always a pleasure. Back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday. It's my pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad to get to your calls. In fact, I want to get to a call first because we've been talking about Joe Biden and the little game he's playing with the U.S. Congress, suggesting to the Congress he refuses to negotiate on the debt ceiling. And now he's even said, well, he believes under the Constitution that he's allowed to raise the debt ceiling without the Congress taking any action at all, which I think is absolutely lunatic. He is not supported by the 14th Amendment. And you notice there aren't a lot of even his own party who are standing up to say, oh, Joe's right about this. The president can order the debt ceiling raised. I don't think it makes any sense. But Pat called in about that. Pat, welcome to the program. What's on your mind?
Well, thank you, Lars. I wanted to talk about one of the pieces that you brought out about the Medicaid piece. And you were, if I heard you correctly, you said that one of the things that they were talking about decreasing was the funding for Medicaid.
No, I didn't say that. What I said, no.
Okay.
Well, don't misquote me,
You
Pat.
did say, but you did. Hold on. You said, please, that people that were receiving Medicaid would have to go to work like 20 so hours a week.
Yes, I did say that.
Now, do you? I assume you know this, but a lot of people who receive Medicaid funding are on SSI or other federal programs for a lot of reasons. A lot of it's medical, and those people aren't able or even mentally equipped to even work, even in sheltered workshops.
If you are truly disabled,
so how are you going to put those type of people to work?
Well, you're not. You just asked a question that
so
answers.
then what happens to that funding? What happens?
We're not talking about those people, are we, Pat? If somebody, do you know what the federal definition of disabled is?
Yes, I do, because I am disabled myself.
It means you are incapable of doing any kind of work. Now, you're talking to me on the phone. Could you answer the phone?
I could answer it. Doesn't mean I would be able to process where it needed to go.
Well, hold on. If you're just answering the phone at a company and saying, I'm getting a call from this person, he's asking for sales, or he's asking for accounting, or he's asking for the warehouse. You're telling me you can call a talk show and give me your opinion, but you couldn't do that kind of work?
No, I couldn't, because a lot of those switchboards are lit up and I'm blind and I would not be able to see which line where it needed to go.
There are lots of blind people, correct me if I'm wrong, who work at productive jobs despite their disability. Am I right?
Well, they do. Only 2 out of 10 that actually hold down jobs in the United States that are blind out of the
I know you know the
4
stats,
million
but
that work.
Pat, do you work at any kind of job?
No, I'm retired. I mostly work for myself because I didn't have to go through the BS of trying to find an employment through dead ends. And a lot of that was because
Pat, I'm trying to answer your question. If you want an answer, you asked me the question. You misquoted me.
I know.
And I'm answering your question. If you are truly disabled and you are unable to do any job, you are exempt from the work requirements. But what should we do? In Oregon, for example, about 1/4 of the population is on Medicaid. Now, certainly not 1/4 of the population is unable to do any job. Should we require the people?
I agree with you there. I agree with you. But when you make that blank statement, making people, it's like back to the day of when we had welfare to work, way back. Not every
aware that worked?
Had a person who could work.
Pat, are you aware that reform in the 90s, supported by President Bill Clinton and a Republican Congress, worked? It got a lot of people off welfare.
I know he did. I worked in those offices.
Oh, you were working
so
then.
I know some of it did.
Hold on, you were working.
It wasn't everybody.
Pat, were you working then?
Yes.
How did your circumstances change from then to now?
Because my medical conditions changed.
Okay, and so you're incapable of doing any kind of work. It sounds like you're very capable to me.
Well, in some cases, but not now that I'm retired and I'm old enough that I'm okay. But I'm just saying, when you make blanket statements like this...
All I said was work requirements, but obviously, if you want me to add the caveat, a work requirement for those who are capable of working, it sounds like a tautology to me to say, well, we're going to require work of those people who are capable of work. doesn't it naturally follow that we're not talking about requiring work of people who are medically incapable of working?
No, it does not in the world we live in today, because people panic and they think about where they're going to get their next meal or how their medical is going to be taken care of.
Well, if
people don't
Pat,
think about.
could we agree on this? Could we agree on this? That for people who are capable of work, their next meal should come from the product of their labor.
Well, they should if they're capable.
And that's what we're talking about. I mean, when you call in and say, how are you going to make people who are incapable of working work? We're not. What we're talking about is all the people on Medicaid who are capable of working and who are currently getting free taxpayer-funded health insurance on the backs of actual workers. For those people who are capable of working, we want them to work. And the Biden administration does not want them to work. They want them to be dependent on the government. And one of the reasons for that is political. If Joe Biden can get enough people who believe I can get it for free, I don't have to put in any effort, as long as I keep a Joe Biden or another Democrat in office, they're going to do that. And to the rest of us, that's an affront. The idea that you should say this person is capable of working. Yes, but the government won't make them work, and they're capable of working, but they don't have to work because they get the food stamps, they get TANF, they get Medicaid, they get Section 8, and there is no work requirement. Pat, you should be aware that written into the federal laws is a work requirement. The exemption from it comes from nitwits like Joe Biden. Now, I did want to say a word about a young lady. She killed a woman who had just minutes before, or at most hours before, gotten married. But the woman who killed her is Jamie Lee Komorowski. And the fact that she's in the news right now, she is complaining that her life is going to be over. Do you know what she did? She was driving an automobile. She was more than 3 times the legal limit of alcohol in her body, meaning you can be 0.08, and if you're below 0.08, you are not presumed to be intoxicated, although you can still be intoxicated below 0.08. She was at more than 3 times that level, so more than 0.24 blood alcohol, and her car hit a woman who had just got married and her groom, her brand new husband, who were driving in a golf cart in a parking lot. And she destroyed the woman's life. The bride was killed. The groom was badly hurt. And now she's complaining, my life is over. Well, you know what? Samantha Hutchinson's life is literally over because of you. And she asks, why did this happen to me? Which makes her a narcissistic fool. And she also says that her driving at 3 times the level of blood alcohol was just a freak accident. No, I think when you drive down the road in a car and you're 3 times blasted because you've consumed alcohol, that's not a freak accident. That's something we kind of expect to have happen. And you're listening to The Lars Larson Show.